So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar launch of Social Justice Matters 2026 Guide to a Fairer Irish Society, which is our annual socioeconomic review. I'm just going to wait a couple of seconds more until everybody gets into the webinar and then we'll kick off. So this morning we have Mansi Rawat, our economic and social analyst, John McGeady, CEO, Suzanne Rogers, research and policy analyst, and myself, Michelle Murphy, research and policy analyst as well. And we will be going through, this was some key areas within our socioeconomic review, not every area, but some of the key areas and some, I suppose, very pertinent policy proposals that we think could make a difference to people's quality of life and also, I suppose, improve our social infrastructure. So I'm going to start off now and attempt to share the presentation. So if I'm one of the team, give me a thumbs up and let me know if you can see the slides. Yes, great. So, Social Justice Matters 2026 Guide to a Fair Irish Society. The electronic version will be available on our website after the webinar today. And if you would like to purchase a hard copy version, just get in contact with us in the office here. So, this is our annual socioeconomic review. I suppose our 2026 socioeconomic review kind of takes into account the current context, so how we might mitigate against the worst impacted global shocks, while at the same time managing the current challenges that we face in terms of, access to healthcare, access to education places, housing, addressing persistently high levels of poverty. There's 10 key policy areas, and we provide detailed proposals and analysis. So we look at areas such as income distribution, tax, housing, sustainability, our international commitments, education, participation, and I suppose we're looking at these areas from the perspective of the common good and making sure that those who are most vulnerable are considered in policy making. Now, our theme for 2026 is the common good in public policy and how to make it a guiding principle in terms of public policy creation in Ireland. So I suppose first off, when you're talking about the common good, we need to, I suppose, iterate what our understanding of the common good is. So we lay this out in our publication, but Social Justice Ireland understanding of the common good is that it's not just about the accumulation of goods to improve personal gain, but it's to create the social conditions and the social floor where individuals and communities can flourish. So really this means that our social infrastructure, our environment, our institutions should work together to benefit everyone in society, and our economic policy should be working towards this to support our social infrastructure, to support our institutions, to support social and economic well-being. And how might government do this? Well, I suppose we should be harnessing the benefits of sustained economic growth and our strong economic position and the benefits of windfall corporate tax gains to invest in policies that foster and support the common good and that enhance our social infrastructure. Of course, at the same time, when we're doing this, we have to make sure that the current challenges that we face, that we address these in a manner that's fair. So looking at demographic change, we know our population is growing and it's getting older, which is a huge success story. But at the same time, it raises challenges around health services, our housing, stock. It raises challenges around the social insurance fund and how we're going to fund services into the future. We face climate challenges, meeting our climate targets. We have made some improvements, but we've a long way to go. The impact of digitalization and AI on our economy and society, and making the economic and social transformations to address persistent levels of poverty and putting in that social floor to make sure that no one falls below it. And of course, making sure that everything we do is sustainable. So one of the key elements of this is services and the services that we all rely on in our society. And these are services that support us individuals, but also support communities. And I suppose we did welcome the publication of the annual progress report last week. And I suppose it outlined, I suppose, the fiscal parameters, but also some of the challenges facing the country. I suppose particularly looked at demographic, climate change, and the impact of AI, and that is positive. However, I suppose we feel that some of the key challenges were not addressed in the report, and we look forward to government, I suppose, laying out their response to some of the more substantial challenges facing us at the National Economic Dialogue. So we're only going to look at two services here this morning, health and education. So as I mentioned, our population is growing, it's aging. We have 4 people of working age for every one older person now. In 25 years' time, that will go down to 2. So which does beg the question as to how we are planning for funding um, services now. Given I mentioned the social insurance fund, we need to look at new ways to fund that, but also we need to look at ways to improve the ongoing funding for our primary care, social care, community care, home care. That means long-term planning, so supporting people to age at home, making sure our health system adapts so we can manage chronic illnesses in place and at home for as long as possible. It means looking at resourcing. It means looking at, for example, the challenge around the workforce for delivering home care and home health. For example, we welcome the commitment to a statutory right, but it still hasn't been delivered. We have a situation now where you have, you know, 3 different, I suppose, providers of home care competing against each other: the community voluntary providers, the private providers, and the HSE. So that is a challenge in terms of pay and conditions, in terms of planning, resourcing. So those are the kind of key things that we need to get to grips when it comes to health. So it's not just the acute system, and we all know about the waiting lists and the challenges in terms of accessing care, but we need to look beyond that and look at, well, how as a society are we going to ensure that we can access care in our community into the future, so we're not so reliant on the acute care system. Then in terms of education, we need to look at skills for all. So from cradle to the grave, so looking at the life cycle approach to skills. We need to provide school places for all students, those, in particular, those with additional educational needs. So not only do we need the school places for those students, but we need the supports that go with that. So that's simple things like making sure there's a school bus to service those students. There are the supports within the classroom in terms of teachers, in terms of SNAs, in terms of other therapeutic supports that are required to support those students in their right to an education. We need to look at how we're going to reorganize or reformat our further and higher education system to meet the green and digital transition, and also as the impact of demographic changes, how are we going to reorganize that system so that it can really provide that life cycle approach to education, not just focus maybe just on school leavers, because that is going to be a challenge facing the higher education system going forward. We need to look at place-based approaches to lifelong learning and training, particularly in terms of green jobs and at a regional level, because those green jobs will be different depending on the region. And we need to continue our focus on reskilling and upskilling to ensure that our society, our population, and particularly the labour force, are ready to take advantage of any opportunities that may present themselves. Obviously, everything needs to be sustainable, both economically, socially, and environmentally. And we did have a good news story last week in terms of Ireland, that we are on track to meet our air quality targets for 2030, and that is positive, and it's down to, I suppose, sustained implementation of policy. But we still face challenges in terms of implementing and aligning our economic, environmental, and social goals, because at the moment our emissions are very tied to our, I suppose, our economic progress in our economic strategy, and we haven't managed to, I suppose, disaggregate those. We need to look at integrating climate adaptation into the budgetary process and moving much more quickly in terms of supporting communities and regions to adapt to the impact of climate change. We need to look at investing in mitigation and transition as well, but at a local level. So we need to ensure that local authorities and regions have the flexibility, I suppose, to adapt and invest in the areas that they see will make the greatest difference, and to be agile and be able to do that at speed. And obviously, we need to make sure that we have a fair and just transition, and that those communities and people and sectors that are most vulnerable are not left behind, and that no one is made worse off by the transition. So now, my colleagues Mansi, Suzanne, and John are going to continue the presentation. Mansi is going to look at infrastructure and resourcing. Suzanne will look at communities and income, and then John will wrap up looking at the social contract. So if you have any questions that you would like us to answer at the end of the presentation, just put them into the Q&A. So I am going to pass over to Mansi now to look at infrastructure.
Thanks, Michelle. And so infrastructure is a broad topic, and it covers a range of areas, but today I'll be focusing on housing because it's foundational and one of the most basic and important needs in life. And also, as we all are aware, it's one of the most pressing concerns that Ireland is facing today. And again, it's also critical for social cohesion, social sustainability, and also economic sustainability. So I'll start by giving some context and touch on key housing challenges. So Ireland's population is expanding. It's projected to reach 6.5 million in 30 years. There's also a change in family patterns. There's declining household sizes and an aging population, which is positive. But this is something like we also need to consider while planning. So the system has not kept up with this shift. On top of that, there's a huge pent-up demand. So the new housing plan has increased the target. However, it still hasn't taken into account approximately 256,000 homes. That's like a backlog that was estimated in the Housing Commission's report. And it has so like with this backlog and the expanding population, it's like we are chasing a moving target. On top of that, homelessness continues to rise, and this is the sharpest edge of the crisis, as and like the recently released emergency accommodation figures show that more than 17,000 people are accessing emergency accommodation right now, and this is without even taking into account people experiencing hidden homelessness. And these are people in emergency accommodation that are like young people, older people, families with more than 5,000 children. So, and then social housing need remains high. The latest figures by Parliamentary Budget Office estimates that this is above 113,000 households, while the government's revised social housing target, as per the new housing plan, is of 72,000 households. So we can like see the disparity. Now the question is, how do we fix this, or how do we deliver affordable and appropriate accommodation? Next slide, please, Michelle. So while scaling up is the obvious answer, it's not just about building more, it's also about building the right homes. So that means a mix of apartments, family homes, accessible housing that is good quality and sustainable and follows the regulatory standards. We also need to plan long term. So housing should support people at every stage in life. That means adoption of universal design principle, better integration with transport, schools, healthcare, and other community infrastructure. So we need like a life cycle approach to housing development and town planning. Also, to address affordability through supply side cost reduction, like if you want to lower prices, we have to look at what's driving the costs up. So we recommend establishing a developer and builder register that requires them to publish construction and development costs. And this would not only promote greater transparency and accountability, it will also provide clear evidence for policy intervention. We can also like open up procurement for builders to come together and buy material in bulk. And the national housing procurement strategy can be central to enabling this approach. So, and for homelessness, like the evidence is clear, housing first works. However, the current commitment of 2000 tenancies, while welcome, is not enough. And we also need to strengthen prevention supports. While like in the new housing plan, there was also an introduction of the national homelessness prevention framework, which is an important step. However, this strategy provides limited detail on how it will operate in practice, and that is a limitation. So we need to strengthen prevention support, because it's also important to know that the financial report for 2024 of the local authorities, it kind of it showed that the spending is 18 times more on emergency accommodation than prevention support. So strengthening early intervention and ensuring supports are in place for households that are at risk is essential. This brings us to social housing. So, a target of 20% would create a more stable and resilient system. It will reduce pressure on private market and provide long-term security for those in need. With this, like the next question is, how do we resource this? So, before we answer this, we need to understand what do we actually need to resource. So that means meeting the housing demand, upgrading the public infrastructure. We need like water facilities, energy infrastructure. We also need to look at the current and future healthcare needs, transportation, and other public services. And this all will require sustained long-term investment. So this means we need to move beyond short-term funding cycle and plan based on population growth and future needs. So basically, as our population grows and ages, our funding needs to increase and our tax system needs to reflect that reality. So now the question is, how do we do this in a sustainable way? Well, there is no single solution to this. However, what it requires a balanced and a forward-looking approach. So first, we need to plan now for long-term investment and not react later when pressure hits. Otherwise, it's going to be as expensive as it is right now, in case like housing is one of the examples. Second, we need to reform and broaden the tax base so revenue is more stable and less reliant on a small number of sources. That includes reviewing the tax expenditures and reliefs, making sure they're effective and delivering value. And some of the other key recommendations include extending 15% of minimum effective rate of corporation tax to all cooperatives over the next few years, increasing PRSI by 0.5% a year to strengthen social insurance system, and then speedy implementation of derelict property tax, and also increasing vacant homes tax and residential zoned land tax, and potentially moving towards a site value tax to encourage better use of land. Ultimately, this is about making sure our system is fair, resilient, and capable of funding level of services and infrastructure that we need to sustain. With this, I'll hand over to Suzanne, who will talk about community.
Thanks, Nancy. And again, like the previous speakers, community is huge. This is a massive, massive, massive topic. And I'm also very conscious. I think this would have been viewed traditionally as very much the soft stuff, the add-on. And yet what we're seeing is that supports to build real communities is now more important than it ever was. As Michelle has already said, local is where it's at. This is where the action is. This is where we live. This is where really what matters to us is what's accessible within our own communities. So, I mean, community is about buses, access to buses. It's about sports. And when I mean that, all sports, because exactly that, our population is growing. It's much more diverse. How do we come together as opposed to pull apart? We need spaces to be. We need access to good nutrition. What we're seeing is more food swamps and food deserts as you go across the country. We need real youth work, not just the diversionary tactics, but genuine embedded youth work right the way across the system. This is about the nighttime economy. This is about park benches. This is about places to be. And also, I think, again, looking at combating loneliness. So again, how do we come together as communities? I'm just going to pick, I suppose, on two particular issues that I don't think get really enough spoken about. And the first one is libraries. And again, just to acknowledge the libraries were very, very, very important to Sister Bridget. So I really just want to focus in on that. But what we could see is that something we take for granted, which is the library, but in the Growing Up in Ireland report, the last one, the cohort, the 98 cohort, participants whose parents used the public library for them at age 9 were much more likely to have a degree at age 25 than parents who didn't use a library for them. But again, that is about having the space and time to be able to access this. A bus, is it close by? Does it open? Libraries have done a huge amount in the last while in expanding out their service provision. What we're seeing is we have, again, the last data I could find, about 765 registered members. There are millions and millions, 76 million items issued across 330 branch libraries, 30 and a half mobile libraries. One is also a cross-border service. So again, they're really, really, really vital. We, again, would advocate for the resourcing to provide that the library is the place, library strategy that is resourced. And I think what was really, really nice about that was that they included in that strategy how the targets and objectives actually relate to the UN SDGs, which again, we are approaching 2030 at the speed of light. The other thing I wanted to focus on as well today was civil legal aid. So at the moment, there was a review of the civil legal aid scheme undertaken. It was published at the end of last year. But what we're seeing is a lot of unmet need in this particular sphere. FLAC, many of you will be familiar with FLAC. They reported a record high number of queries in relation to domestic violence during 2024. Their information and referral telephone service could only respond to 21% of the calls it received. And Ailish Barry, she spoke recently at a committee, and I suppose to put it into context, she was saying that the legal aid board is chronically underfunded, but what they could see was that the legal aid board had a budget of 64 million. In 2026, it received an increase of 8 million to deal with what's coming down the line. They have creaking in ICT infrastructure, and also don't forget about the incoming the Blooded Migration Pact work that's going to have to come down their way. By contrast, the horse and greyhound industries received 100 million in this and last year's budget. 58 million has been spent on the Ryder Cup, 1 million less than what the Legal Aid Board received in 2024. So again, just to put that in context, but these are two areas that I suppose are embedded in our communities, and at the same time maybe don't get enough focus. I'm going to move on then to the income piece. Again, anybody who is familiar with our work knows that we put a figure on the Silk data every year. So we are a country that still has a poverty problem. We still have a lot of people living in poverty in this country. I think the next slide has some figures on it, Michelle, does it? Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So like 12.6% of the population in poverty, again, in what is a wealthy, wealthy, wealthy country. As Mansi has touched on, we have a lot of children living in homelessness accommodation, in emergency accommodation. We have a lot of children living in poverty and deprivation. We have big increases in older people as well, experiencing deprivation and poverty. As always, the conversation about poverty is always go get a job, go get some work, increase your earnings. But what we're seeing again is this kind of stubborn level as well of people who are working but still don't earn enough in order to be able to make ends meet. What we've seen, again, always is that reliance on short-term transfers. We've, again, what I probably won't even get into it, but there's a lot going on at the moment about sort of, meeting particular needs with these kind of short-term answers and not really looking to the long term, not really looking, kind of further down the line. What we saw in the progress report was that they actually talk about like a greater focus on intergenerational equity, and they see that as essential in policy formation. And I often think as well, like on an individual level, for me to, I suppose, invest in my future self, I need to be somewhat assured of what type of income is coming down the line that I am going to be able to make ends meet. So then when we look at, I suppose, our proposals in this space, So this would primarily be about those who are unable to work. Anybody who is able to work, again, what we can see is, and I will mention AI at the outset as well, that is having a very disruptive impact on the types of jobs that are there, who's getting them. So we are seeing, and again, I suppose it's in those jobs where a third level university degree would have been your way into sort of well paid, high paid jobs. They are now the sort of jobs that are being threatened or being disrupted by the use of AI. We are seeing a lot of underemployment. Again, as we said, the working poor. Ireland has a very poor track record on work and disability, the link between those two. And again, as we always like to say, work and employment are not the same things. Lots and lots and lots of people work very, very, very hard and don't get a paycheck for it. So we're talking about carers, we're talking about volunteers, we're talking about looking after your family, looking after the people around you in whatever capacity that is. So again, just to acknowledge that. And then if we look at our policy proposals in this space, it's always going to be providing enough core income for those who are unable to work. So anybody who's been removed from the workforce, whatever, for whatever reason, that level of social welfare does need to keep pace with the rest of society. That is why it must be benchmarked. Our recommended benchmark is at 27.5% of average weekly earnings. That's really, really, really key. It's inequality that does a lot of damage. Poverty is one thing, inequality is something else, deprivation. That's a lot of damage is done in that space. So that is why this is essential, just to keep track and to keep pace. A living wage is vital. And again, as we can see, there's a gap between the national minimum wage and the living wage. And what you're really saying then is that if there is a gap between those two figures, somebody who is working full time, and particularly in the cities and the bigger towns, because accommodation is really the crux of this, is that they are having to make serious decisions about the things that they are going to forfeit this week and next week. Again, an inability to invest in future you. The refundable tax credits, again, is another key aspect of our policy proposals in this space. For anybody who's on low incomes, they are really not benefiting from changes in annual budgets to the tax credit system. This would be a way of putting, again, just quite simply more money back into the pockets of people who were on low incomes and are working full time. And ultimately, I suppose it is about how far does your wage go? How far will it bring you? We are going to see, I do think, I suppose, increases in prices across the board because of what we're seeing across the world now. And the prices of everything is going to go up. So again, if we are looking at long-term supports for households that are removed from the labour force for whatever reason, or are able to work but may be precarious, low paid, these are the sort of proposals that we would like to see put in place, again, just to ensure that people have enough to be able to get by on. So I think I'm handing back to John then to see us out. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. So look, at the beginning of our presentation this morning, Michelle spoke about the importance of the common good as a guiding principle for social policy. And, this concept of the common good, of shared well-being, it implies a social contract between the person and the wider community, between the citizen and the state. Now, when communities support each person's human development, the flourishing of their talents and well-being, as we've heard, this then contributes to the enhancement of the whole community. Now, as we've outlined, it's government's responsibility to invest in policies that foster that common good, and fairness and solidarity are central to this. Now, in our current context, we face the challenge of preparing for the impact of potentially prolonged energy shocks and of mitigating the impact of the energy price crisis for vulnerable households. At the same time, as we've also heard, government have to address the ongoing problems of how to deliver housing, healthcare and other services, how to address persisting high levels of poverty, how to meet our climate targets, and to do so while protecting those who are most impacted by the transition. So maybe if we go to the next slide there. Yeah. So we're living through a period of significant change to our environment, society, and economy. All of this requires a state with the capacity to intervene, now not merely to respond to crisis, but to shape our shared future. A new social contract underpinned by a commitment to the common good, would enable Ireland to respond to these challenges with the ambition to achieve a fairer and better society. And what might this look like in practice? Well, Social Justice Ireland has proposed a policy framework for a new social contract that identifies 5 overarching policy outcomes: a vibrant economy, decent services infrastructure, good, just taxation, good governance, and sustainability and a just transition. Now, in the midst of change, we have an opportunity to set, structurally transformative goals for our country. In practice, as you can see from the table on the screen, our economy requires financial stability and sustained economic growth, secure employment with good conditions and decent wages, a more just economic structure overall, and action to harness the ongoing digital revolution through which we're living. Our community requires quality and accessible services and social infrastructure, adequate public investment and population-based planning, a minimum social floor below which nobody will fall, and a full realisation of our social, economic and cultural rights. As we've heard, to resource all of this, we require an adequate overall tax take and a broader tax base. We also need to look at how the taxation system can be more equitable and also can facilitate reduced income inequality and good tax governance. Indeed, all of this requires good governance more generally. So we're looking at open and transparent and accountable structures, social dialogue taking place with all sectors of society. This requires real participation and deliberative democratic processes, and also reformed policy and budget evaluation. And then we have to ensure that everything is sustainable, not only environmentally, but also socially, economically. And this requires increased environmental protection. It requires new indicators of progress and new natural capital accounts, climate action and a just transition, especially for those households and communities who are most impacted as we move to a green economy, and balanced regional development. Now, as the events of the recent weeks have sort of painfully shown, when people feel unheard, frustration spills over, and the social contract comes under significant strain, ongoing dialogue is essential. The development of a new social contract requires that government engage with all stakeholders in a deliberative process of social dialogue. Now, this can foster trust and adopt a problem-solving approach, allowing us to do a number of things. We'll be able to identify problems at the earliest stages. It'll allow us to challenge assumptions about where and how value is created in our society. It'll assist us to find pathways towards alternative policy options. And it'll allow us to build consensus in support of more sustainable, equitable outcomes for everybody. Social Justice Ireland proposes that the obvious place to begin is with the 5 pillars of social dialogue. So we're looking at employers and organised labour, the community and the voluntary sector, farming and environmental sectors, and government, both at the political and the official level. And we believe that properly facilitated social dialogue can provide communities an opportunity to reflect on and to articulate their own needs, so that not only the loudest voices are being heard. And here, civil society, where the community and voluntary sector is particularly important in Ireland, is critical. These outcomes do not emerge sort of spontaneously. Effective social dialogue requires time and investment and genuine engagement by government. However, we firmly believe that sustained and in-depth social dialogue across all sectors can strengthen our democracy and result in long-term solutions rather than short-term fixes, and ultimately renew the social contract. Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, John, and thanks to Mansi and Suzanne as well. So I am going to open the floor to questions now. And so people can put, I see there's some in the chat and some in the Q&A. So what I am going to do now is just open up some of these setting question. So the first one there, well, there's two. So one is on education for myself, and one is on homelessness for Manti. So I'll take the education one first. What pathways exist for people with international qualifications in community work and other fields to have their skills recognised and utilised in Irish advocacy spaces? I suppose we have always advocated for, I suppose, a skills transfer program, particularly, I suppose, in terms of further and higher education, so that people who are coming into this country, I suppose, particularly outside the EU, so outside those kind of education streams where there is a recognition of qualifications from different fields, that's recognised within the EU, that we need to have some form of, I suppose, skills transfer recognition program that recognises those people coming from other countries, both in terms of trades that they may have, but also in terms of their qualifications, be it community work or community development or other fields. At present, such a skills transfer program doesn't exist per se. There's a much longer procedure to go through, but it's something that we would advocate for. So Mansi, there's two other questions here, but Mansi, I'll go to you now. There's a question in about the homeless figures which came out at the weekend, and in particular the rise, the persistent rise in homelessness month on month. So beyond increasing housing stock and social housing, are there any other policies that the government should be implementing to address this, I suppose, exponential rise in homelessness?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think homelessness, it remains one of the most visible consequences of Ireland's housing crisis. And I think immediate action is required to reduce the growing number of people in emergency accommodation. And housing first model is one of the proven solutions, and it offers permanent housing first, followed by wraparound services. This approach has proved to be highly effective for single adults with complex needs. This one of our policy recommendations is to extend this housing first model to families. While it is important, that other prevention focused methods be also sorry. So while while it's important that this housing first model be extended to all. However, at present, we only recommend it to families because addressing the consequences of homelessness is specifically it has deep-rooted consequences on the long-term development and psychological impact and has psychological impact on children. And some of the reported impacts include children not having enough space to learn to crawl or walk, not being able to properly chew due to lack of cooking facilities, mental health difficulties in children. And this is one of the reasons why I think one of the short-term actions, immediate action, can be extending the housing first models to families this would help in mitigating the serious development and educational and health impacts that homelessness inflicts on children, while supporting long-term stability for entire households. And equally critical is prevention supports. So right now, as I mentioned earlier, there have been there is a national housing prevention framework strategy. However, it does not there is not enough information as to how it would be in practice. So I think one of the key things would be that we increase funding for prevention, tenancy sustainment, and early intervention services within local authorities and homeless service providers to prevent homelessness in the first instance. And this could mean that we implement early warning and intervention systems to identify and respond to risks such as eviction notices, rent arrears, and sudden income losses. So And this is something that is done in Finland and France. So I think we can take on that model, and we can also like look at robust implementation of tenant in situ scheme where local authorities buy property from a landlord who's selling it and convert it into a social housing tenancy. Other than that, I think we also like need to look at the vacant homes tax. Right now, like we are living in a country where a lot of number of homes remained vacant, while there are a lot of people who are accessing emergency accommodation. Like the last week's figures showed that there are 17,500, which is again like it shows the scale of the crisis because it's only increasing, it's not decreasing. So like right now the vacant homes tax is at 7 times the local property tax, and it is also so what and there is also like the compliance is not strong enough. So if, like the data from the revenue commissioner reveals like a stark gap between what the expectations are and what the actual declaration is. So we saw that during the first chargeable period, there were only 5,856 properties that were declared vacant, and in the second chargeable period, it reduced to 3,049, and only 2,000 were liable to pay taxes. But the CSO's data recently showed that there are approximately 70,000 vacant homes, and that was based on the electricity consumption. And if we look back at census 2022 and census 2016, we've seen like there has been almost like there have been almost 50 to 60,000 homes that have shown to be empty in both the censuses. So that kind of indicates like a mismatch in the data. So this kind of so that's why like we propose that we need to lower first of all the eligibility, and we need to increase the rate for vacant homes tax to 10 times the and also have a strong compliance. I think these are some of the recommendations that we can do for immediate. And but like overall, I think um while like these are short-term measures, overall, it kind of highlights the need for a shift towards increasing the social housing target, because if we don't have the sufficient stock, then we are like it's again gonna have the same problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Suzanne, there's a question there for you. In terms of those on low incomes not benefiting from the tax credit system, what would Social Justice Ireland recommend government look at in relation to those who are parenting alone and in low paid employment?
I don't know whether they're the same people. So if it's lone parents in low paid employment, but I mean, in terms of the lone parent piece, I mean, childcare, 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 childcare. So like, I think a lot of the supports that would help anybody on a low income or a precarious income, or um, somebody who's having to maybe take, because it even goes back to that original question, Michelle, about the people's skill sets and then the types of jobs that they end up. So you can see within the migrant population, they're very, very educated, and yet because of the skills transfer piece, they're having to take jobs that maybe don't match their skill set. So I think in terms of if it's lone parents who are on low incomes, that's a conversation around affordable housing. That's a conversation around affordable childcare as a separate piece. You know what I mean? If you wanted to add on to that. So the refundable tax credits will, again, anybody who doesn't use their full tax credit would be able to get a top up at the end of the year. But I think the supports for lone parents on low income, I think it has to be around the ability then to be able to make your wage go further, which I do believe is going to be a question around income. It's also going to be a question around our energy costs. I think if we're getting to a stage now where putting on the shower is going to be viewed as a luxury good, or putting on the immersion is going to be viewed as a luxury good. But I think for lone parents and employment, I think childcare, real affordable accessible childcare that would be there, whether you use it 4 hours a day or 8 hours a day. There's lots of limitations in that. I mean, that's a whole other conversation as opposed to trying to support childcare. But for me, I think that would be the answer. It wouldn't necessarily be an employment support. It would be to support that particular parent and that household through other ways.
Thanks, Suzanne. So there's a couple of environment ones there, which I will take. So the first one is, what is your view of the current carbon tax? And the second one then is expand on what could be done to secure a just transition on climate related issues. In terms of the current carbon tax, we have always supported the carbon tax. I suppose our concern would be is that the funding from that, some welcome funding is going towards retrofitting electronic vehicles, electronic vehicle grants, charging scheme towards the acre scheme for farmers. And then the rest of it goes towards the living alone allowance, the qualified child payment, the fuel allowance, which, are areas that we feel the social protection budget should be covering anyway. So we would have a concern about that, given that, over time, ultimately, the amount of money we take from the carbon tax should be decreasing as behaviour changes. However, our current concern is the pause in the carbon tax and what that means for the calculations that was made for those payments in the last budget, whether we are going to be paying for those twice. The pause also means that, it's paused until October. However, there will be another increase in the carbon tax in October because that's outlined in the legislation. Out to 2030, there will be a carbon tax increase in every budget. So does this mean we'll be facing two increases in carbon tax at a time when particularly vulnerable households are going to be, paying for home heating oil, for example, we'll be facing into the colder period of the year. And what does that mean for vulnerable households? I don't think there's been enough consideration of that issue. Another concern would be, what does this mean for the carbon tax going forward? Because it is there, to, I suppose, incentivize behaviour change. But we do see that even despite, and this is before the current crisis, despite rising energy and oil prices, our usage of those continued to increase, I suppose, in line with where our economy was going, and that is a challenge. But ultimately, we do need to look at implementing more polluter pays principle taxation measures, and move beyond just the carbon tax alone. But we are supportive of it. In terms of how we can secure a more just transition on climate related issues, even this morning we have reports of the Taoiseach talking about a package maybe to incentivize heat pumps and electric vehicles. So we have to make sure that if the transition is going to be just, that those who are most vulnerable are supported. But we also have to look if what we're doing is right or is going to the right places. For example, most of the electric vehicles sold in this country are not being sold in the right places. They're being sold in urban areas where really we should be incentivizing people to use public transport. Where we need to be selling the electric vehicles is those areas when people don't have the option to take public transport and need to use their cars. But those are the very areas where electric vehicle take-up is much lower than it should be. So we need to think about our subsidising, and should we be subsidising them towards particular areas? Do we need to look at reinstating the grant for installing chargers, for example, and improving the overall charging infrastructure? Then, on a broader sense, in terms of this, beyond things, we hear a lot about flood defences and other adaptation measures, and I guess learning from what happened in the Midlands. A key area of actually securing a just transition is investing in community capacity building, because you need to ensure that communities can engage in the change that's coming, can take advantage of any benefits, can be ready for the change, and also that those communities can inform the policy direction of the spending and funding that is going to be available, to make sure that money is going where it should be going and that we can reduce our emissions, but at the same time make sure everyone has a better standard of living. There's a couple here on housing, Mansi. I think you might have answered some of them, but there's one in particular on implementing housing first, or the more practical methods that we could look at based on what is being done in other European countries. And then maybe the impact of, I suppose, the drop in terms of exits and preventions from emergency accommodation in 2025 compared to 2024. So Nancy, I might ask you to comment on those.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle, and thank you for those questions. How can we? Okay, so like yes, so yeah, implementing housing first model, if there are no houses, that's a challenge. However, if we look at the statistics, there are a lot of vacant properties and derelict properties, and while like and that if and as mentioned earlier, like the CSO's residential vacancy based on metered electricity consumption, that was the statistics that was released quite recently, and it indicated around 70,000 dwellings that are vacant. And similarly, the geodirectory that's published every year, that kind of also indicated the same amount. And if we also add on to like in addition to this, if we like look at the derelict properties, there is somewhere around 100,000 properties in the country that are vacant and derelict, and there are policy responses. However, we see limited results around that, like the repair and lease scheme, or like the scheme on vacant property refurbishment grant. So like I think and the challenge with that is, first of all, it's not of scale. Like there have been like the targets are not huge enough to make an impact. And secondly, the grants are also in a way interest-free loans to repair properties for leasing for local authorities. Like this is if so there was this report by Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland, and that revealed that renovating these vacant and derelict properties can be unattractive to many of the aspiring owner occupiers because it's not financially viable. So we also need to like look at these like already existing grants and scheme and bridge the gaps, so that, and this could include like administrative bottlenecks that cause delays, and a lot of times delay is one of the reasons why it's not financially viable. The price just increases, or there is other like challenge. So these are some of the things that we need to look at, because this is like an existing housing stock that is in the country that can be brought back to use without having to build like additional no, like building more is essential, but like right now, if we look at the immediate uh like solution. And similarly, there are a lot of vacant homes as well. And again, the problem over there is the compliance. I think these are the things that really need to be looked at, to look and like we need to look at housing from a holistic perspective, not just like housing first would only mean that it needs to be implemented for new homes. It can be used for the existing stock as well. We can bring back those stocks into use. So I think that is one of the things. And potentially, I think we need to look at moving towards like a more simpler like system that promotes better use of land. And for that, we recommend site value tax. That was also proposed by like recommended by the Commission on Taxation of Welfare, that because it could effectively address these challenges and encourage productive use of land. So
Thank you, Nancy. Now I have two more questions before we wrap up. So one is for Suzanne and one is for John. So John, I'll go to you first. A question in, I suppose, about the current global instability, and I suppose what we've seen here even in recent weeks in terms of community frustration and challenges and frustration among some groups that they're not being heard, and that this actually challenges the very idea of a social contract. And how can we promote the social contract, and the whole concept of social solidarity at a time when, social solidarity certainly seems to be breaking down globally, but also even in Ireland within communities, the very idea of it is being challenged. And then for Suzanne, the question for you, once John is finished, is in terms of welfare rates and benchmarking and indexation, how do we make sure that they're set at such a pace that we can set that minimum social floor, and can we afford to do it?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, a challenging question, but look, we can't control what's happening internationally. Okay, I mean, government from a foreign affairs point of view has to do its best to influence international developments as best it can, but we have to be realistic about what Ireland can achieve in that front. We are a small, open, a small open economy, that is, as we have seen, then you know, impacted by what happens internationally. But as far as this whole piece around social cohesion goes, was there's two pieces that are fundamental to social cohesion. One is that people's material well-being is adequate enough. The second is that people have meaningful political voice, and that they feel that they have that meaningful political voice. And so the first part requires many things that we've talked about today, which is decent, accessible services, social infrastructure, adequate incomes. The second part speaks to what I mentioned earlier, which is meaningful social dialogue and real engagement in the policymaking process. And that can happen on two fronts, both at the national level, I kind of already touched upon, but even at the national level, dealing with the different representative bodies, it needs to be at multiple levels within those representative bodies, so that you're engaging with people all the way down through those structures. And then also beyond that, at the local level, having ongoing social dialogue between local authority and communities. And obviously Socialist Ireland has, long championed the public participation networks, and they can really be a locus for that social dialogue. But ultimately, what we saw was, whenever people are hard pressed with sudden shocks, if their material well-being is already adequate, they can withstand, they have greater resilience, there's greater community resilience, they're able to withstand some of those shocks a bit better. They still hurt, but maybe they don't cause as much damage as maybe we've seen them causing. And that's why having adequate incomes, adequate social infrastructure and services really is essential to this piece. So, I mean, it's those two things coming together. The question is whether or not a social contract can actually be developed in this context. This is precisely the context in which a social contract needs to be developed. It is precisely in these circumstances, when we're seeing social cohesion and the social fabric fraying, that you need to have renewed emphasis on that social contract and renewed dialogue in order to achieve it. And it needs to be not a top-down approach, but actually building up a new social contract through social dialogue, so that everybody has a voice in the process. Suzanne?
So, Suzanne, briefly to you, if you can, in terms of indexation and benchmarking, and then I'll wrap up because we're almost at time.
I mean, the indexation and benchmarking really is vital to tie that minimum social floor to some level of reality, as opposed to what a particular minister may decide on budget day. So, I mean, everybody's in favour of a benchmarking system. We are in favour of a benchmarking system that is linked with average wages. Again, it will just mean that as inflation moves, wages will move, and social welfare will keep in line with that. And for those who might argue, well, that traps government into meeting a particular level, obviously they can always have years where they can say, okay, well, because of this reason or that reason, we can go above or beyond it. But I mean, really, we can't afford not to. If you have a cohort of your population who are unable to work for whatever reason, to basically condemn them to a life of poverty by keeping social welfare rates too low, so that they can't put the heat on, they can't put the light on, they can't have a nutritious meal a couple of days a week, they can't go into town for a cup of coffee, they can't meet somebody they can't afford. I mean, we're talking about the homelessness thing, like that is, they can't afford to put a roof over their head. Like, it doesn't make sense. And again, economically, poverty is costing the state millions, if not billions, in undoing the damage done The education system is trying to undo it. The justice system is trying to do it. The health system does a lot of heavy lifting here in terms of the damage that is done to individuals from a life in poverty. So even if you don't care about people, even if you're not interested at all in the social aspect of it, of human flourishing, economically, not providing a decent level of decent standard of living for anybody who's unable to engage or only partly able to engage with the paid labour force. I suppose it doesn't make any sense. And even just one thing that's just occurred to me when we were talking about, again, we really need to be future focused. We really need to be looking for the long term here. This 12 months, 12 months, 12 months, 6 months thing is really not working for us. And even in terms of fuel allowance and carbon tax, we are going to get to a stage where it's going to cost just as much to cool things down in summer as it is to heat things up in winter. And fuel allowance isn't taking any kind of account of that. So there really needs to be very much a strategic, long-term, we need vision and we need ambition. We need very difficult conversations to be had. But again, if it's about us investing, if it's about me investing in future me, it's about the government of Ireland investing in the Suzanne of 2040, if she lives that long, or 2050, definitely the Mansi of 2040 and 2050 and on into that. How are we going to look after each other and grow well and grow old together? Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. So the publication is available on our website. If you'd like a physical copy, get in touch with us. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. We really appreciate you giving up your time. And just so you know, next Wednesday, the 6th of May at 1:30, there will be a lunchtime webinar. Suzanne will give a webinar on our National Social Monitor, which is due to be published next week. So you'll be able to register for that on our website from this afternoon. So with that, I just want to thank you all for coming. We appreciate your time and all the questions, and we hope you find the publication useful. So thank you very much.